This podcast is sponsored by the Trader Funding Program by Forex Analytics. Do you want to trade somebody else's money but want to receive the lion's shares of the profit and take none of the risk? Pass an assessment with a one-time fee and trade your own live trading account. There's no time limit to pass. Various account sizes are available based on your needs, and each comes with the Forex Analytics platform and access to one of the most active trading communities in the markets for a period of time. Visit traderfundingprogram.com for more information.
Thank you, everybody, for attending the MicDropMarkets podcast today. We are very happy to welcome Leonid Mironov. Leonid is currently head of materials at PACAT Capital Management in Hong Kong. He has over 17 years of experience in global commodity and commodity equity space, currently focusing on China and Southeast Asia. PACAT is a Hong Kong-based long-only hedge fund manager investing in China and Asia with an exceptional track record going back to 2000. So welcome, Leonid. I've had you at my spaces before, so I'm really excited that we can sit down with you for a full hour. And welcome again.
Thank you, Tracy. I appreciate the invite.
All right, Leonid, thank you so much for coming on. I think now I remember where we know each other from. I think we've been on the same Twitter space a couple of months back. So one of the topics we want to explore in greater detail today would be electric vehicles and their promises or potential disappointments. And at the time of the recording of this podcast, I just got the news that a couple of hours back, a Tesla factory in Germany was the victim of arson by hard left environmentalists. So it looks as even the left-wing environmentalist zealots are losing trust in the EVs, or if it's going to come down on their bad side. So if you would provide us with a little bit of an overview, what's your take based on your experience and when you observe the market and certain changes in the energy and transportation sector? What's your overall take on the promise and risks with electric vehicles?
Ralph, well, yeah, thank you for that. That's actually a very poignant place to start. I think we're in the valley of despair where it comes to electric vehicles, right? I mean, the promises were so great, and we were just about to move over to all electric fleets all over the world, and now it seems like that's not really happening anymore, right? But I have a slightly more pragmatic view of electric vehicles and the electric vehicle industry as a whole, because obviously, PACAT is based in Hong Kong, and our primary focus is China. And I think electric vehicle shift means different things in different parts of the world. Because I think in China, in 2023, for example, every third vehicle sold was an electric vehicle, right? And over there, the electric vehicle revolution is not really a revolution anymore. It's a development. It's a development in the market that's sort of being implemented, and it started really sort of robustly just before COVID, and since COVID it sort of gathered pace, and we're in the middle of a process that will likely see about 60% of vehicles sold in China be electric vehicles by 2030, right? Whereas if you look at the United States, for example, I have no doubt we will never get to 60% electric vehicles sold in the United States. For sort of practical reasons mostly, right? I mean, electric vehicles have to come with infrastructure, right? It has to come with charging infrastructure. It has to come with the grid infrastructure for it to make sense, right? Because it does not make sense to just compare a gasoline-powered vehicle to an electric vehicle and say, look, electric vehicle produces no emissions, thus it's better, because you have to take a holistic view on all of this. What does it take to produce? What does it take to ship? What does it take to lug about the extra ton of weight, right? On every trip, everywhere you go, right? All of these things need to be considered. And if you're in a place like China that went all in, that is making sure that its grid is, robust enough, but also flexible enough to accommodate all these electric vehicles charging. It's one thing. If you are in a place where distances are large, and it's not uncommon for people to actually go on cross-country trips like in the US, right? Then all of a sudden, the EVs make a lot less sense. And so I find this conversation to be somewhat dominated by straw man arguments, because in the US, people are saying, well, look, EVs are not going to replace your car if you're driving 700 miles across Wyoming every morning. Yeah, sure, it's not. But then if you live in a dense enough urban environment, it might. If you live in a southernly enough place with a dense enough population, it might, provided that your local utility provider is willing to embrace things like EV charging rules and benefits and incentives, but also using your EVs to power some of your domestic appliances at peak hours. As long as everyone marches along the same road, it is possible to argue that EVs are a net benefit. But of course, outside of China, it's very hard to imagine a situation where that actually happens, because it's hard to get utilities and consumers aligned on the same path. Not impossible, but just very, very hard. And I think, interestingly, Europe is kind of, as usual, squished in the middle somewhere, because it's not quite China in the sense that it doesn't have this holistic approach to, or command approach, whatever it is you want to call it, to making sure that everybody implements the same policy and has the same view of electric vehicles. But at the same time, nor is it the US, where the distances are large and the people really love their driving. Whereas in Europe, I think an American average trip is about 40 miles, whereas in Europe, an average trip is under 25. So like Europe, kind of by all metrics, is actually fairly suitable for electric vehicles, but at the same time, the grid development still lags behind that of China. So the reason why I kind of take such an interest in electric vehicles right now, because of that, right? It kind of brings together technological development, future fuels and fuel usage, but you also talk about labor unions and the legacy automakers and their role in all of this. How do you treat this oncoming threat from Chinese manufacturers with all these extremely cheap vehicles that are about to hit the rest of the world, right? And also in the view of US versus China geopolitical standoff, right? I mean, how does the fact that China can make all these vehicles fairly cheaply, how does that fit in, right? And what about corporate actors outside of state actors, right? I mean, can they maybe cooperate better than the states? And I don't think we have solid answers to any one of these questions by themselves, but I think the next couple of years will be very interesting to see how all of this develops. I think it's very important to let people know of this, so that sort of we all keep watch as the situation develops.
And what do you think this means for, European markets are importing Chinese electric vehicles, but so far American markets have stayed away from that. And so how does this affect China's reach in general, being that basically they're locked out of the North American market?
I think this is the question, because if you think about it, there are only two major markets where you can charge high prices for vehicles, which is the US, obviously, and Europe, which is where the high-income consumers are. And these are the markets where Chinese companies could have potentially made money. Now, the US is, as you say, close to them for now, at least directly, which also, by the way, an interesting side story, which we can come back to. But the European market is not close to China just yet. But the pressure that Chinese new vehicle makers, because let's be honest, in China, legacy automakers are facing with the very same threat of Chinese new automakers, right? Because China had an auto industry from before the electric vehicles became a thing, right? And these were normally partnerships between an established Western manufacturing company and the local state-owned enterprise, right? And these things have quite a lot of capacity that is that has been mostly idled recently, right? Instead, the consumer demand has shifted to these new electric vehicles, and a lot of these very same state-owned enterprises created their own electric vehicles brands, right? And they've created new brands of vehicles that seem completely unrelated to their main holding company, but nevertheless, it's fully owned by the state-owned enterprise, right? So in Europe, you have legacy manufacturers like your Mercedes-Benzes, like your BMWs, your Renaults. Like I think Renault in particular is really screwed. But these guys are all trying to fight this China Inc., right? This EV sort of ecosystem that developed in China. And their argument to their governments it will be, look, we employ all these people. If you don't protect us from this Chinese competition, all these people will be left jobless, right? And I mean, obviously, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but nevertheless, I think for the likes of Renault, this might be an existential threat. So I fully anticipate the European governments to put up tariffs, right? To put up tariffs either through this carbon scheme that they're introducing from next year, but maybe more directly to compensate for what they will call as, dumping pricing. But interestingly enough, I would note two things. One, Chinese cars for sale in the UK and in the EU are priced at about 3x the price that you can get them in a Chinese showroom, right? I mean, you compare the BYD, because BYD is doing a big marketing push in Europe just now, right? I mean, I see like 10 BYD ads every day between YouTube and on the tele, right? And that to me is symptomatic of how seriously the big Chinese manufacturers are taking the European market. But at the same time, the prices, when you compare them to what you can get these very same cars in China for, about 3x. So to me, it seems like they're preparing for life with much higher tariffs, and then they will just reduce the prices effectively to account for the tariffs so that they're still very profitable relative to the Chinese market, right? I mean, so I think the end result would be higher unit prices to European consumers and Chinese manufacturers still gaining a foothold in Europe. And the other thing is Chinese manufacturers have already started acquiring European legacy names. So Volvo, for example, is a Chinese brand now owned by Geely. Polestar is also part of the Geely group, but it's ostensibly a Swedish automaker, right? And I think this will also continue, right? MG here in the UK is also a Chinese brand, right? So through these local quote-unquote partnerships, I think Chinese brands will still make inroads. And I think the net result is Europe will be a significant driver of profitability for Chinese makers, at least in the very near term.
I mean, I think it's understandable that the Chinese kind of are so jumping on the EV train, not just for economic reasons, but I think also for security reasons. I mean, the more they can run their economy, or the more they can switch to EVs, it's easier for them to produce electricity via coal than it is for them to depend on fossil fuels, which to a large degree they still have to import. But what's Europe's role in all of this? As you just described, right? Based on expected tariff developments, probably EVs will not be as cheap as they could be. In many areas, if reports are to be believed, European automakers kind of lost out in the innovation race against the Chinese as well. So it's not the quality difference that can change this. It's not the price difference. So what motivates the Europeans to jump on the EV hype? Do you think it's purely politics, ideology, and environmental considerations, or do you think is there something else going on as well?
I think mostly it's that. I think obviously these moves are so seismic that there's lots of moving parts. But I do think that we've had 20 years worth of people telling us that the world's going to end unless we stop burning oil like immediately, right? And for 20 years we've chugged along rather nicely, but the pressure gets built up, and the younger generation in particular really believes in this sort of not burning oil stuff, and it's a very fertile ground for all these EV mandates, right? And now in the UK, we have a mandate to switch to all electric from 2035, although that's likely going to be pushed out to probably like 2040 or something. In Germany, in most of continental Europe, mandates of that sort are being discussed. And I mean, again, 2035 is just not realistic. It's not going to happen. I mean, let's just acknowledge that and, put it out there. But nevertheless, there is clearly pressure from European governments to move to electric vehicles. But the problem for everybody is, I think, at the time when these mandates were conceived, Chinese automakers were an afterthought, right? I mean, are the Chinese guys going to figure it out? No, of course not. Look at them. You know, they're producing all these last generation of Volkswagen Golf, right? I mean, or maybe they're producing like an A8L, right? I mean, to the designs of 2004, right? I mean, they're not a concern. And yet, literally 5 years later, in 2021, you start seeing genuine competition from Chinese automakers. And then 2 years later, in 2023, it's clear that the way that China has done it, where they've separated materials from battery tech, from parts, from assembly lines and branding, they were able to create this almost a Cambrian explosion of new manufacturers of vehicles, right? And through super intense competition, they've refined their product offering, right? That is now good enough, if not better, than their European counterparts, especially on the pure EV side. And I think that has taken everybody by surprise. And I think to this day, European policymakers can't quite get their heads around this sort of development. The other thing is, in China, again, I mentioned this EV Inc. Approach. That entire ecosystem kind of pulls itself together. Like as CATL, the biggest battery maker, improves battery technology, it gives better batteries to all its customers, and then all the customers sell more vehicles, pay more to CATL. CATL invests more in the development of better batteries still, etc. It's a virtuous cycle. And wherever a Chinese manufacturer sets up, and like BYD, for example, is already present in 6 countries globally, and it's probably going to only raise its footprint, it brings together with it orders for CATL. And then CATL might set up manufacturing in places like Indonesia, and then it's easy for CATL to then bring on board Chinese manufacturers. So of course, if you think about like a full ecosystem working like that, and I'm leaving the party role outside of this conversation for now, but it goes without saying that all of it has been pre-planned and pre-designed by the party, but executed by private enterprises sort of at the end nevertheless. But of course, Mercedes-Benz finds it hard to compete against the whole ecosystem, right? So does BMW, so does Citroën or Renault or any of these brands, right? I mean, at this stage, the Chinese manufacturers put out 30 million vehicles a year, right? I mean, this whole China auto industry Inc. that is so good at working together, it's almost impossible to outspend or outmaneuver, right? In terms of fight for resources or anything like that, both human and natural, right? So, and I feel like this is new, right? I mean, new with a capital N. I think this is a development that really hasn't occurred to the policymakers. And if it did, they're all kind of thinking that maybe it might just go away somehow, I don't know, right? So thus the muted response. But I think the real test comes this year. As Chinese exports into Europe reach real numbers, a couple 100,000 vehicles a year sort of thing at the very least, right? The policymakers will have no choice but to start formulating a response. And then the question is, if you over-respond to China, it will probably over-respond to you in some other way, right? And especially given the degree to which the German companies in particular are involved in trade with China, right? I mean, it makes for a difficult sort of balance to find between overall European interests, but also interests of European automakers, but maybe more importantly, interests of European consumers. Because, and I cannot emphasize this enough, in China right now, you can buy an EV, a reasonable EV, for about $12,500, right? I mean, if you have $20,000, you can buy a fancy EV, right? Or a great example that I thought was really important is Buick, a General Motors brand that has been mostly sunset globally, but in China, it's still sort of a fairly big business. They're able to put out it's called the E4, a really good Chevrolet Blazer-sized electric vehicle for about $23,000 in its basic configuration. The cheapest EV GM can put out in America struggles to be at $45,000. It's loss-making at $45,000. So this just kind of highlights the issue for everybody, that even within the same company, Chinese infrastructure and Chinese ecosystem enables much cheaper production costs, right? And we're not even talking direct subsidies, because GM is not getting that much in the way of direct subsidies from Chinese government. Even their Chinese operations are not. And yet they're able to cut their costs basically in half by keeping everything Chinese and in China. And like that creates such massive pressure on everything in the automotive chain that I do not see how it cannot come to some kind of a explosive collision somewhere in the in this coming year.
And since you brought up the fight for resources, I kind of want to bring this to kind of the critical minerals, metals that are needed to produce these EVs. Because of BRI, or because of China's inroads into Africa and their subsequent processing capabilities within China, does this put China at an advantage far ahead of, say, the West as far as EV production is concerned?
I mean, Tracy, that is absolutely what it does, right? I think it's very important to acknowledge the point that I made earlier, that whilst the execution of this program has been done by private Chinese companies, the planning has been done by the central party, right? I mean, they've promoted this guy called Wang Gang back in 2008 to the Minister of Science and Technology. And he had a vision that he would like Chinese automotive manufacturers to seize upon any new technology in auto manufacturing and then lead the way on that, right? And he suspected it is either going to be electric vehicles or hydrogen, right? And he thought about it. Then the new the Tesla Lotus thing came out, Tesla Roadster, must have been 2008, right? And he thought it's going to be electric vehicles. And from that point on, he decided that he was going to advocate for promotion of the idea that Chinese companies should go out and seek resources that will be, parties to the supply chain, right? So lithiums, cobalts, that sort of thing, right? Nickel to a degree. The more interesting thing maybe is that the battery chemistry has been quite a volatile thing over the past couple of years, right? I mean, in 2021, there was this argument that there's not going to be enough nickel for all the batteries because we can only have nickel batteries that are good enough for the big passenger vehicles. But actually, CATL most notably, but other battery manufacturers too, have figured out how to make phosphate-based lithium phosphate batteries, right? And now most Teslas, for example, have an LFP battery in them rather than a nickel-based battery chemistry. And my belief is that now that we're on the verge of sodium batteries making their industrial debut, again, by virtue of CATL's processes, it is possible that the outlook for what kind of minerals are actually considered critical is likely to change again. Because if it's sodium isn't really that constrained by supply, right? I mean, whilst yes, China's got a handle on a lot of stuff in Africa, it might not be as critical as we think. And so on the lithium side, for example, it's quite clear that we can have lithium production in Nevada, we can have lithium production all over Argentina, and like the spodumene, sure, right? I mean, it's mined, it's more difficult to find, but really there is some form of lithium or another, more or less across the world. So it's very hard to say that Chinese will have some kind of stranglehold on the raw lithium. Lithium processing, though, once again, we're coming back, that could be a choke point for the future. But as battery chemistry solidifies and as we move closer to solid state batteries, right, we might discover that the way that the Chinese guys, because of the early mover, quote unquote, advantage, might turn out not to be such a big advantage. As chemistry changes and we realize we need other metals, maybe we flip over into reorganizing priorities. But as things stand, yeah, for sure, Chinese have an advantage, especially on the cobalt side. But then you look at the cobalt price over the past year and a half, right? And we went from a significant shortage of cobalt to an overproduction, that is likely to stay in overproduction mode until 2027 by the looks of things, right? And that is an example of what happens when Chinese decide they don't want to make money on the metals, they want to make money on the final product. So they're quite happy to compete away the prices in both cobalt and lithium as best they can, right? And they're also trying all sorts of new mining techniques. So, for example, direct lithium extraction is a thing that Chinese guys are trying to be on the very cutting edge of, right? The chemical extraction of lithium that enables maybe a quicker process, but so many other things might go wrong with it. But nevertheless, it's interesting that they're trying all these things to stay ahead of the curve, like you're saying.
But there isn't when we talk about this, and I'm glad you mentioned also the advances or the potential advances in battery technology. But isn't one of the problems in the general debate about the switch to EVs that very often, not you of course, but particularly its proponents, right? They look at they compartmentalize what they look at. They look at the EVs per se, but there is of course the entire infrastructure around it. You mentioned it before. We talked with Eric Scheider about resources a couple of weeks back, and copper is a big thing, right? Because it's going to be very, very difficult to build the loading infrastructure without copper. So even if you, let's say, we say, hooray, like we can build all the EVs, we get all the batteries. Okay, but now you need the charging infrastructure. You probably need quick chargers. People don't want to wait 40 minutes or maybe overnight until their car is charged. Then so far, and maybe this has changed as well with new batteries, they tend to be heavier. So the wear and tear on tires is more. Parking infrastructure, right? I don't know what does it mean for a parking complex of several stories if all of a sudden these cars are much heavier. Do they have to rebuild them? Do they have to reinforce them? So again, it's things I don't know. So when we take really the bird's eye view on everything that's connected to it, is the role, you mentioned it before, in cities. I mean, I can imagine it's going to play a huge role in cities because it will have a perfect impact on real estate. Imagine you live in an area where there's lots of traffic and all the traffic becomes EV traffic. That's definitely going to increase the value of your property. If it's small distances, that all makes sense. But this idea that we will have a complete shift where everything is going to be EVs. I mean, is this at all realistic from kind of if we take everything that's connected to it into account?
I think you're hitting the nail on the head there, in the sense that, yes, absolutely. If you don't have this holistic view, you're never going to arrive to the right answer, right? And I think it's never going to be 100% anything, right? Nor should it be, right? I don't think that the government should go out and tell you guys, from 2035 onwards, we're all doing EV stuff, right? I mean, I don't think it makes sense. I think EVs, if they're good enough and their value proposition is strong enough, will, in their own right, find a way to dominate the market, right? And I feel like things you've mentioned in high density urban areas, it's very hard to argue against EVs, right? I have a rental, well, actually, we used to have a rental flat just around the corner here that's on the first floor, so facing the road. And ever since the introduction of an electric bus on this route and electric only access for, these large haulage vehicles, it made a hell of a difference, right? I mean, it made a hell of a difference in terms of the amount of soot, the amount of residue that you have to clean out every year from, all the filters and whatnot, right? From the point of view of an ordinary resident, it makes sense. However, it's like you say, but what are the costs associated with this transition? Like, zero emissions is great. Why is it great? Well, cleaner air and all the stuff. But do we all understand that it's not so easy to do, right? I mean, look at the impact of the lithium production process or cobalt production process, or the ethical implications of the mining methods as they are right now, or like you say, the fact that you have to lug around extra weight, which is wear and tear on all the components, which in turn is the thing we don't really talk about, the flammability, right? I mean, electric vehicles, once there is an electric fire, it's much harder to put out than an ordinary car being on fire, right? And then especially the likelihood of an electric vehicle being set on fire during charging is high, right? So imagine the very same garage that all of a sudden it catches a blaze, like the whole thing might go down because it's much hotter fires, right? All these things we need to consider and have an answer for. Now, I'm not an engineer, so I find it hard to say what exact precautions need to be taken. I can tell you that this is something we need to consider. And as EVs become more and more prevalent, as transporting of EVs becomes an issue, right? I mean, we had an entire fleet of Teslas go on fire because at the end of last year, if you remember, right? I mean, and it was a fairly widely reported incident that the fire just burns so hot that it cannot, like the one sort of car carrier, you cannot deal with just the one car, right? I mean, you have to segregate an entire section and sort of chuck it all overboard or do something to it, right? I mean, otherwise the whole thing sets ablaze. And those are practical limitations for a world that has been conceived purely theoretically, right? I mean, all these policymakers thought it would be a great idea. They wrote the policies, and now as we start and implement them, we find all these issues. And yes, we need to acknowledge them and we need to say that they exist, which is why we don't all need to move to EVs. And when we do move to majority EVs in the cities, for at the very least, we need to make sure that infrastructure exists. Now, I'm not as concerned about copper and critical mineral availability on account of thrifting mostly, right? I mean, we have been able to decrease the amount of copper that goes into an average electric vehicle by a factor of 2.5, right? I mean, we started with about 120 kilograms, 125 kilograms. We're under 50 now, 48 and a bit, right? On average per Chinese-made EV. Seems to me we can get down to 30, right? I mean, from the sort of the indications that I've heard from the industry, right? I feel like similar thrifting concept will be applied to everything, right? I mean, as we start thinking about what is the best way to deploy chargers, wires, all that stuff, right? I mean, over time, the practical needs in terms of copper demand and all that stuff, it will slowly go down, whilst at the same time, we will see greater copper production and higher copper prices, still just not super crazy high, the stuff that people have been talking about. I will also note that we talk about electric vehicles as purely vehicles, right? And as competitors to gasoline vehicles. But of course, EVs, because of the batteries they carry around, and if the fleet becomes big enough, all of a sudden, you're talking about an awful lot of energy being trapped in these things, right? And it then becomes quite reasonable to start asking questions about how do you create greater integration between grid and vehicle. So grid to vehicle transfers become quite important, because you can think of it just about just charging the vehicle and then discharging it through movement, but you can also use it as source of power for power cuts or at peak times or whatever else. So for example, in China, again, they're quite open about this idea that vehicle to grid and grid to vehicle transfers must be a core part of development of the more robust electric grid. And I think this is somewhere where China is uniquely positioned because of the way that they can just tell consumers what to do, and consumers will do it when instructed, right? In Europe and in America, obviously, the utilities don't have the luxury of telling its consumers what to do. Instead, they'll have to incentivize through pricing, right? But interestingly enough, I think California is a great battleground state for that sort of reason, because with all the solar and with all the wind and mostly solar really though, that they're generating, right? I mean, you want to incentivize charging at peak hours, and how you bring that together, I don't know, right? I mean, that'll be a very interesting thing to see. I heard the PG&E executives talk about how they want to work with Tesla and how they want to educate Tesla customers on the best ways to make use of their massive batteries in their Cybertrucks and whatnot. But I feel like that's such a long journey that I don't even know where they start or how they start.
You mentioned something else I just wanna chime in on for 1 second, because what you said about, for example, about fires and battery cars burning hotter and longer than alternatives to it. This reminds me a little bit in the 1930s with the Zeppelin hype, right? Until the Hindenburg burned, or the Concorde, right? Ultrasonic traveling or ultrasonic airplanes were supposed to be the new norm at some point. And now I think it basically is non-existent after there were 2 accidents with the French Concorde. I mean, is it possible? I mean, I'm just asking you to theorize about this. Is it possible, let's say you have a close to an apartment building, such a massive fire breakout with, God forbid, but a significant number of casualties, that the EVs, or at least the EV hype, is going to have the same fate as air balloons and the Concorde, that simply then, as the density of EVs becomes more and more, the risks get higher and higher. And if you have a couple of these accidents or incidents, people will turn their backs on them.
I think that's a non-zero risk. I think this is something that is feasible, especially with the older EVs, right? So there are 2, I think, biggest obstacles for general EV concepts that they need to overcome, and both of them are to do with safety. One of them is this fire issue that I think, again, everyone should acknowledge and work towards resolving, right? I mean, what that actually means, but whether it means reinforcing parking garages or parking structures for EVs and mark suitable for EV parking, unsuitable for EV parking, something like that could be a good sort of starting point, or whether it's through better internal controls, emergency shutdowns, emergency fire measures built into EVs. I think I would have to leave it to the engineers to work on, but I will point out that it is something they are working on. For example, the latest Xiaomi vehicle SU7 that is being presented to us later in the month, they have put the battery into a special I suppose it's a big holster type thing, and they're saying it's good for safety from both, rocks hitting it, from overheating, but also from colder weather. So, for example, in the cold, EVs obviously lose about half of their range, right? If your battery is concealed in this sort of kind of holster, they argue that the losses to cold are much lower, right? Whether this actually helps with safety, let's find out. But I guess what I'm saying is that people are working on it. Maybe they resolve it. I hope they resolve it, obviously, right? I mean, we don't want anything like, obviously, here in London, we had the Grenfell disaster a couple of years ago. We don't want anything like that repeating again for any reason, EV fires included. And the other thing that I think EVs need to overcome is obviously recycling, right? I mean, how clean is your vehicle if you can't recycle the core materials, right? I mean, if your lithiums and nickels are in it forever and you can just sort of, the best you can do is chuck it into some parking lot and forget about it, right? I mean, obviously that once again, the fleet of EVs gets big enough, obviously this is unacceptable for anyone, right? I mean, you cannot, I don't know if you remember, but just before COVID, there was this Chinese biking app craze, right? And all these bikes appeared all over the world, right? The yellow ones and the green ones, I can't even remember what they were called, but most of these bikes ended up in a landfill in China, right? I mean, and there was these photos of, look at all these things that we made for no reason, had a sort of quick cycle on, and now they're back in a landfill. Like, I don't think consumers will find this acceptable, and so recycling of batteries needs to be worked out. And again, we're not quite there yet, but there are companies both in America and in China that are working on this problem. And I can only say that I think it'll be better for everybody if they figure it out, right? And but they haven't yet.
And that all comes down to cost, right? Because, I mean, there are some ways to recycle, and we've seen this not only with EVs, but say solar panels and wind turbines, but that's not really happening to a large extent just because of the sheer cost of that. So how do you look at, do you think we're going to be able to get these costs down? And how much do you think that, that's going to impact how consumers feel about purchasing an EV? I mean, we kind of already know the Asian markets are already open to that, but we just haven't seen Western markets even get close to that, particularly in the United States. And so, how do you kind of see this all playing out globally?
Well, I think there are, like, within that, there are two critical pressure points. One is power availability, right? I mean, if your grid's good enough, or if you can find a solution that actually works. For example, in Indonesia and Thailand, part of the reason why EVs are quite successful, have been quite successful lately, and it looks like they're going to have a great 2024, is because solar panels are so easy to install. There's lots of sun. It's quite easy to install your own rig at home, where you just plug in your car, charge it up through free electricity generated through your own solar panel, right? Great, fabulous, at least in theory, makes lots of sense. Plus, there are all these incentive programs for power generation through solar panels that again go really neatly hand in hand with the greater EV usage. That's not the case in the UK, for example, right? I mean, good luck with that, right? We were in the environment where we don't have enough nuclear capacity, right? I mean, in the environment where we're reliant on gas and coal burning, right? I mean, is there really that much sense in implementing a big move to EVs immediately. I mean, arguably, yes, again, because, you know, you're still getting rid of immediate emissions from the vehicle sort of right in front of your window, but obviously the benefits going to be lower, right? I mean, it's one of those. And so I think for consumers in the UK, in the EU, the cost argument still remains the strongest. If they were presented with the Chinese vehicles at Chinese prices, I think we would have had a much bigger move to electric vehicles, right? Whereas I think in the United States, it's a slightly different argument, because I think having a large fleet of Chinese vehicles is just not acceptable by anyone at this stage, right? I mean, maybe outside of California again, right? I mean, I just don't think it's politically feasible that Chinese guys are going to get any kind of import allocation of any kind, right? I mean, whether they'll be permitted to import at all is a big question, which is why Chinese producers, both battery makers and OEMs, they're all looking at places like Mexico and other places with a free trade agreement with the US to set up production there and to see what they can do in terms of navigating this tariff regime or any future tariff regime changes. You know, if there's a change in the presidency come November, right? So, for example, as of December 2023, every third car imported into Mexico was a Chinese-made car. Every 10th car imported into Mexico was a Chinese car made by a Chinese company. It was imported into Mexico. A lot of it is Tesla, of course, but not all, right? And I do think that this Mexican angle will become more and more critical, because as Mexico is looking for ascendance into the BRICS, can you really sit on two chairs at the same time? Can you have a free trade arrangement with the US and be a member of the expanded BRICS universe? I don't know, right? I mean, this is something for AMLO and his chums to figure out, or the new lady president, whomever she will be, because that's a very big question. The Chinese will certainly try. They will set up production in Mexico and they will try and supply the US markets from Mexico, right? And they'll probably adopt this sort of foreign brand strategy. It will be done through like MGs, Volvos, Polestars of the world, but they will try, right? And Tesla, for obviously never forget Tesla. But they will try. And again, the cost argument will be key, because again, Chinese guys are able to make these things significantly cheaper than the rest of the world. Part of it because of cheaper labor, but not a very significant part. Most of it is due to efficiencies and economies on the side of materials purchasing, and manufacturing.
Oops, sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. That makes sense. So how do you think that you know, so how do you assess supply chain risks associated with investing in Asian EV companies, particularly in light of global geopolitical tensions and disruptions? I kind of want to move this to kind of the supply chain issue.
Look, I think this is the key point, right? The reason, as we sort of discussed earlier, the reason why the Chinese guys were able to have this success is because of being able to secure supply chains early. How reliable they're going to be going forward is interesting, right? I mean, greater tariffs and sanctions from the US onto China and Chinese manufacturers will create changes, right? And changes that will, of course, create instability. I don't know the degree to which they can actually impact the business model of, say, a Geely, the state-owned firm that owns a bunch of these EV makers. Whether they can just say, no, we're not going to do the US market, it's just not worth it for us, and we're going to supply the rest of the world, and then they can kind of keep everything as is and continue developing their presence in all these new nations. But given the amount of money available to auto manufacturers in the US, it just seems to be, it's just such an interesting prize for everybody that they'll probably risk it and figure out a way of separating almost their Asian supply chain for Asia, which includes China and all the sort of neighboring countries and members of RCEP, the trading bloc over there. And on the other hand, you have almost a separate business line that supplies the US that has to be at least an arm's length away, that you can say, look, it's a separate business, it does its own thing, we're not really interfering. To the degree to which they'll be successful, let's see, right? I mean, if you recall the original limitations on NVIDIA exports into China, they were quite lax, and like lots of things seeped through. And then sort of implementation of that obviously tightened significantly, and obviously now it's much harder to export NVIDIA stuff into China. I feel like it might be the reverse of Chinese exports into America. At first it might be quite lax, but eventually the screws will be tightened, especially if we're looking at another Trump presidency, right? I mean, obviously, because he's likely to be much stricter on that.
But so there is this component, right? This is from the necessary resource input. Wouldn't that on the long to medium run almost give an advantage to classical internal combustion engine cars? Because if you have a product that needs more input factors, that needs, let's say, more complex supply lines, and then you have a world where supply lines are significantly more threatened, would you not by default opt for a product that is potentially equally efficient, but has fewer input factors and particularly and shorter supply lines, and is therefore much easier to secure?
Well, but again, that depends on how you define inputs, right? Because of course, ICE vehicles are much more complex within themselves, right? And you're talking about 2x number of components of average ICE versus an average EV, right? Now, that's not, I mean, that's not an apples to apples sort of thing, but you know, I think as a framework, I think it makes sense to acknowledge that EVs are kind of simpler, right, in many ways, right? So as long as you can solve the big questions about like, where's my battery going to come from, right? Say CATL becomes a global battery manufacturer more than it is now, right? They have a factory in Mexico, factory in Brazil or something, right? That can supply your North American effort easy enough. Then all of a sudden, all this metals thing just goes out to one side and you let CATL deal with it, and you just source your CATL made battery from a CATL factory in Mexico or Brazil, right? Now, is this feasible today? Kind of, right? I mean, going forward, let's see what the actual definitions will be. Because there is a world where you're right. There is a world where ICE vehicles are just easier to make, not because they're technologically easier, but because there's just so much less headache, and we will already have all the capacity installed and all that stuff. But I think in aggregate, given the economies, like the one thing I think it's important to remember, right? The reason why ICE vehicles are so expensive is not just because of technology, it's also because of all the legacy costs and associated with it, right? I mean, the labor unions, the sort of retirement obligations, like all that stuff, right? And you restructure them every couple of years, but nevertheless, it's still, there's this big sort of bag of bricks that you have to lug on your back as a nice manufacturer, right? As a new electric vehicle manufacturer, you don't have to do any of that. And your process is simpler. And your process is easier to automate, right? And all of a sudden, you're saying, okay, well, actually, setting up an assembly line is quite cheap and quite quick. And so that, I think, will be the final answer. That's just going to be a lot of more final assembly in these sort of free tradey type parts of the world that can supply the US, and that'll be the attempt, at least for the US market. But I think the more fundamental point remains the cost, right? If there are people who are able to supply electric vehicles to your economy at like $12,000, $15,000, $20,000 a unit, and your domestic manufacturers are supplying the very same vehicles at $60,000, right? I mean, in effect, you're forcing your consumers to subsidize your domestic manufacturers with the difference, right? And I mean, for geopolitical purposes, you can say, guys, you have to tough it out, right? I mean, we're all in it together, right? I mean, we have to pay the salaries of these union people, and we're also, we don't want to give our money to the nasty Chinese people, right? I mean, I'm doing my Trump impression here, but how long can that last, right? I mean, because consumers aren't, idiots, and they don't live in a vacuum, right? I mean, at some point, the fact that the same things are much cheaper elsewhere in the world, like, it seeps through, right? I mean, and then you start having like gray imports, right? I mean, people importing one vehicle or two vehicles, right? I mean, for themselves, for their friends or whatever. And slowly but surely, these lines tend to get blurred. The idea is, do you want to let the market play out by itself? Or do you want to introduce tariffs first and then sort of slowly negotiate the complexity of the tariffs or the application of the tariffs? My guess is they'll go with tariffs first and then figure it out, kind of thing, right? But whether it's the best way, I don't know, right? I mean, maybe not.
And since this is a podcast for investors, kind of want to ask you a little bit about kind of any, or if you can discuss without giving anything away, obviously proprietary information, kind of any notable investment opportunity venues that you're looking at, and maybe any challenges within this sector that you have encountered.
Oh yeah, for sure. Happy to discuss challenges, Tracy. Last year was full of those. I mean, if you look at performance charts of your NEO, XPengs, and Li Auto, right? I mean, they're down significantly from their all-time highs, right? I mean, they achieved in 2021. A lot of it is due to price competition, right? I mean, part of the reason why Chinese vehicles are so cheap is because their producers are in a price war, right? I mean, they're fighting each other because functionality is really quite good across the board. So price competition it is, right? And that kind of means that profitability per unit has been below expectations for a large chunk of the producers, especially on the mass market. Last year, obviously, sort of as a disclosure, right, we have a long only China fund and we have a long short Asia product. Both of them are involved in the names we might be discussing, but nothing I say constitutes a recommendation of any kind. And past performance is no guarantee of future performance. Nevertheless, we have had a meaningful position in electric vehicle manufacturers last year, especially in the second half. Some of it is done really well, but still, I believe given the importance of electric vehicle ecosystem to the China story as a whole, I think they're really underpriced. I have a belief that CATL, the battery maker, will eventually be China's largest enterprise, right? I mean, this is not a move that I'm expecting in the next 2 to 3 years, but say by 2030, once we really get going on, on EV moves all across Asia, I think CATL will be China's largest enterprise. That said, obviously, in the near term, in the environment of a price war, the prospects for any individual car maker can fluctuate, and we've had obviously a very high-profile name, Hi-Fi, which they made these futuristic cars, kind of looking, what 2001 view of futuristic cars was, that sort of thing. Lots of bright lights and that sort of thing. They have about 3 months worth of cash burn left, and it looks like they might be going bust. But I think opportunistically, you just look at these companies, are they a real business or not, right? I mean, the way I define it for myself is if they have a run rate of 100 billion or so dollars in sales, and they cannot make an EBITDA margin on that, that's not a real business, right? And in China, the largest automakers are approaching that number in terms of gross sales, and some of them definitely have decent profitability at these numbers. Now, again, my personal favorite is a company called Li Auto, which conveniently is listed in the US, but that is not a recommendation for anyone else to follow. It's a company that to me represents a very interesting value proposition because they make larger vehicles. They make SUVs, and they've now debuted like a minivan type thing, like a really high-end luxury minivan type thing. So high margin per vehicle, maybe lower vehicle count. But still, they're going to make about 800,000 vehicles this year, which I think is pretty good going. So to us, it's figuring out whose business model is actually equipped for the long term and who is just there to tick the box of the local government or central government policy initiative. And again, much like Detroit in the 1920s and 30s, I fully expect rapid consolidation, right? I mean, already we've seen Volkswagen come in and purchase 20% of XPeng. We are having, obviously, Stellantis buy into Leapmotor, is another Hong Kong listed EV maker. In fact, it's NEO and Li Auto that remain unattached, so I'm very interested to see what happens there. I think for the first time in a long time, buying a Chinese entity isn't just access to China market, right? I mean, we are at the point where Chinese makers have genuine technological and business process acumen that is valuable to automakers in Europe and America. I think like GM, for example, like I already mentioned this, but the fact that GM China, i.e. Buick, can make vehicles for half the price that GM US can, ostensibly utilizing the same technology, like that's not good. It doesn't say good things about GM in Michigan, right? I mean, same for Ford, right? Ford is currently making like 500,000 units or so in China, mostly for export to other Asian countries. The economies on those vehicles are superior to those that you have in Dearborn, right? And you're like, okay, well, what does Ford do around that? I don't know, but I think greater consolidation is the way forward, and maybe cross-border consolidation. Now, again, obviously, political issues remain, and we're obviously wary of the Chinese leadership, and maybe the U.S. leadership might be wary of paying money for Chinese companies. But business logic dictates that for especially for European entities and for Americans struggling with this sort of EV technology, buying a Chinese company might be an answer. It might not be if they choose to completely not get involved in the EV side, but if they choose to pursue EVs and if they think that these EV mandates stay the way they are, then they kind of don't really have that much choice, right? Figure it out for yourself or buy a Chinese competitor, because I think there'll be a lot of them for sale in the next year or so.
And Ralph, did you have any final questions since we're coming up on the hour? You're muted.
Leonid, so Leonid has covered everything that I wanted to know.
Excellent. Thank
That's what we
you.
like to hear.
Leonid, did you have any final thoughts for our audience when kind of evaluating this industry?
I would like to once again ask the audience to think about the EV question as a part of many sort of moving parts. And like we've discussed the environmental side, we've discussed the business side, but there's also the politics angle, right? I mean, because there's all this talk about how in China, electric vehicles are being sponsored by the central government, and there is this largesse that is being passed on to the manufacturers, and the subsidies to the buyers and whatnot. And part of it is definitely true, right? But I would like to encourage people to really think about what does a subsidy to an automaker really mean, right? Especially for our American listeners, because we've had the bailout of GM, right? Over the course of the global financial crisis, we had the Ford. I mean, obviously didn't take any government money, but we have tariffs and limitations on how many cars can be imported into America and means by which they can be imported. These are all also kind of tariffs, right? And what we talked about earlier about if Chinese cars are available for $20,000 and you're forced to buy $60,000 vehicles in the US that are sensibly equal, then that $40,000 delta is also a form of a tariff, right? And again, it's a form of holistic thinking about the impact of electric vehicles. That's not, I mean, obviously, the direct grants for capacity creation in China are significant, right? I mean, there's obviously local governments that are trying to give even more money to their production companies to encourage, especially exports these days, right? I mean, and that obviously is uncompetitive, and things like the EU tariff is likely going to account for that. But in the overall scheme of things, it's not just the direct money transfers. It's also the ability to create a labor pool that is highly skilled. It's the ability to create an environment where you can build new factories at what's known in the industry as China speed, right? I.e. very quickly without much concern for local neighborhoods and whatnot, right? I mean, all these policies have positive sides and negative sides, right? I mean, implementing the China model in the US is going to be terrible, right? I mean, it's people don't want to subsidize manufacture. I mean, in China for the past 30 years, households have in effect subsidized manufacturing sectors through depressed wages mostly, right? That's not a policy that's going to be acceptable for anywhere else in the world. But it's nevertheless something that China has been able to put together and now reaps the benefits and the costs of it, right? For all the talk that we have about weak Chinese consumption and low household share of GDP is the flip side of proactive industrial policy, right? I mean, if you have a proactive industrial policy that suppresses wages for the workers, well, the flip side is workers don't make enough to buy their own goods, right? And that's not good. So way that the current debate is structured, we're kind of ignoring the overall impact of any industrial policy. And the Chinese policy might have positive implications for mini makers in the short run, but might be a drag on it in the long run. And I would encourage everybody to think bigger, right? I mean, bigger picture view on all of this is essential to formulate a reasonable view, because in my experience, it's either EVs are great and we're all going to end up driving in them, or EVs are terrible and I don't ever want to touch one, right? I mean, sure, I mean, I can understand both those views, but really, guys, let's be honest, as usual, the sort of the right answer is somewhere in the middle, right? I mean, some EVs are good for some uses, but they're not going to solve all our problems.
Excellent. Leonid, thank you so much for being our guest today. I will put all of your contact information in the description below. Please follow him on Twitter. He's a great source of information. Again, thank you so much for your time today. And
my pleasure, Tracy. Thank you for having me.
We will see you on Spaces again.
Happy to come anytime.
Thank you, Leonid.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Ralph.